So I'd like to talk about living inside the ISS, if we could, please. Because like I said before, this is kind of a 12 days to me. That's the equivalent of a vacation, but you're also working consistently during this process. You're employed to do all sorts of different tasks while on the ISS. But I mentioned, is there ever any time to actually just sit there and be a person and kind of look out the window and go, holy shit, in space?
Yeah, the view is spectacular. But no, you hit on the main problem with enjoying the view, which is that you're very busy. You're up there as a paid astronaut, not to have fun, but to help construct the space station or maintain it or resupply it or do some science. And those things, on top of getting 8 hours of sleep a day, if you can, or maybe 6 or 7, and eating the meals you need to eat to stay functional, those things take up almost all the day. I think our days were scheduled in 5-minute increments from shortly after we woke up until an hour before we went to bed, or an hour and a half before we went to bed. And that hour and a half was supposed to be personal time, but invariably, most of us used most of it to catch up on things that hadn't gone quite as planned during the day and therefore hadn't ended on time.
Oh, man.
So I had hoped to send lots of email to friends and family, but it was hard to send email. It was hard to find the time.
So you actually you can send things like emails. That's interesting.
You can send emails. And with attachments, you can have teleconferences with your family. But the everybody's favorite thing to do, of course, is to enjoy weightlessness and to enjoy the spectacular view from 250 miles up.
Yeah, I mean that's $1 million view. But
it's really spectacular. The Earth is much more beautiful in reality than the photographs suggest. The photographs are spectacular.
I believe it.
Videos, you've seen movies of high-def movies of the Earth viewed from space. They're really spectacular. It's even more beautiful when you see it in person.
Well, you're making me sad I didn't join the astronaut program. But, gosh, I had a question, but it kind of flittered off. But I will say, do you miss anything about living in that situation, or are you just too busy to kind of settle for a minute?
No, I miss being in space. It's really special. There are some things that are difficult. I'll come back to those, but the things that are easy, moving around. You can move around effortlessly once you learn the technique. It doesn't take. You can move around with basically fingertips applied to walls. You can push off gently and float across a module. Eating's fun, but a little bit challenging because the food doesn't go down into your stomach as far as you would expect it to here on Earth. It bounces around. That's
another thing I was going to ask about. We'll get into that in a second, but yeah, please go on.
And then there's the view, and maybe I've missed the most important but intangible thing, which is when you're on a mission, a NASA shuttle mission going to the International Space Station, you know you're doing something important. Important for the future of humanity, important for spaceflight. And it's really special to be part of a large team that's doing something like that.
Yeah, I can imagine. It feels like, okay, I've done something today. It doesn't matter if I only slept 2 hours. I did stuff. Because you only have so many hours that you're going to be on Earth or off the planet. And I get it. You know, because those stressful situations, sometimes you put up with it just to have those kind of moments. So you mentioned kind of having that connected feeling when you look at home, looking down on the planet, and you feel like you're more connected to Earth. But and you've also mentioned that you were quite busy, just doing all sorts of tasks. Let's maybe circle around to the unglamorous details about living in space, just because, I don't know, we could share all kinds of fun stories, like the Instagram version of space living, but I thought, let's touch on being an actual person and talk about some of the gross things about maybe being in space.
I don't know that much of it's gross, but a lot of it's really challenging in sometimes annoying, sometimes difficult ways, sometimes fun ways. For example, you can put your pants on, your trousers on, 2 legs at a time in space. That's easy. That's kind of fun. But while you're doing that, you will be tumbling around the inside of your space shuttle or space station, bouncing off walls, bouncing off other people who may be eating. You learn very quickly that what matters in zero G is to minimize your movements. Never make a big movement. Never give a big
no
push
interpretive dancing.
There was a story I learned, maybe apocryphal, maybe real, of an astronaut who found themselves for the first time in zero G, wanted to go to the far end of the module, and pushed off mightily with their legs they felt like they were jumping, I guess, up high. But they weren't. They were going to float across in zero G, but the big push they gave themselves meant they were going very quickly. And about halfway down this module, they realized all they had now to stop themselves was their hands and their head, which aren't nearly as strong and robust as their legs were. And so apparently they hit the far end fairly hard. And that was one of the things that, we all heard and we all learned from. Push off gently. You can go faster when you get better, but like everything in life, learning to drive, start slowly.
Fair enough. Yeah, absolutely. Baby steps, especially when you don't have gravity to assist you, because
and everything's different. Also, if you move around too quickly, you tend to what they call it spinning up your gyros. You can get motion sick from quick movements in zero G.
Really?
And a case in point was coming from the space station to the space shuttle. The space shuttle docked to the space station. Here's the space station like this.
Yeah.
And so you'd go along the space station's axis, along the modules, into the docking port, take a right angle turn that way, and now what you would think is up in the space station is actually forwards on the space shuttle. And then you would grab onto some handrails and swing around and go from the shuttle airlock to the mid-deck, up the ladder to the flight deck. And this was a large number of right angle turns that you could do pretty quickly by grabbing a handrail as you passed it and then letting go after you'd turned 90 degrees.
Okay.
But if you did it quickly, especially if you weren't well adapted to space, it would make you sick. Make you nauseous anyway, not sick necessarily, but it would make you nauseous, and you had to learn to slow down. You had to learn to slow down when you're eating as well. You can't gulp your food down. You can't get very large amounts of food very quickly to your mouth on a fork or a knife because they tend to float off. And
wait, so there's actual forks and knives involved?
There are
I thought
actual
it was all
forks,
just kind of in Capri Suns.
Not much in the way of knives, but we used forks a lot, essentially, or spoons. You could eat moist food with a spoon.
Okay.
It's not gravity holding the liquidy food into the bowl of the spoon. It is surface tension. The food kind of gloms on, and you just have to move it slowly, because if you move the spoon with food quickly, the spoon will outrace the food, and then the food is unmanaged. It's now a little ball of something moving on its own, and it will invariably find the cleanest shirt on the crew and go flat. A friend of mine flew some cookies. They were really nice cookies, butter cookies, and he remembered halfway through the mission that he had these cookies, and he said, "Let's eat the butter cookies." He went to get them from a mid-deck locker, and there were a tin of cookies. And he was so excited. And he undid the tape around the edge of the tin. He opened the tin, and a cloud of cookie dust went out like a miniature slow motion explosion from this tin of cookies, because the cookie tin had been shaken during the fairly violent shuttle launch that we were on a few days earlier. And none of us stopped to think about what shape these cookies might be in. These crumbly butter cookies might be in by that point in the mission. But we spent a fun few minutes basically hovering around the mid-deck like goldfish with our mouths open, sucking in.
I was going to ask, because if I had a special treat on board and it did that, I would definitely make the extra effort to go kind of around like a little frog or a fish and just kind of gobble it in the space station.
You do have to be careful not to inhale the food, but yes, it's fun. We would play with M&Ms. We would fire M&Ms to each other, and you just basically aim them at somebody's mouth, and they slowly go in a straight line across the module, and somebody can get them a few have like
competitions later. Or something.
A lot of fun. So those are challenges, but they're fun challenges. The challenges that are less fun are using the bathroom in space, or say washing and shaving in space. we'll talk about the bathroom for a second. The space shuttle had a waste management system, it was called, rather euphemistically, that was a toilet. But unlike an Earth toilet, which works with gravity, everything you produce falls down into the bowl and is covered with water, which limits the odor, and you just flush and it's gone, right? Well, in space, with essentially no gravity present, there is actually gravity, but you feel like you're weightless. Everybody's floating. All the byproducts of your digestive system would also float. So you sit on a toilet that now, instead of using gravity, uses gentle airflow into the toilet to help keep everything where you want it, in a giant bowl underneath the seat. There's a separate funnel and hose for peeing in. And these things take some training. They're not easy to use. In fact, they're complex enough that there is a checklist, a fairly short checklist for using the urine collection system, but a fairly long checklist for using the actual toilet. And you have to configure everything just right. Opening valves, turning on fans, powering up the system, and so on, and then making sure you leave it spick and span, really clean for the next user. You don't want to make enemies by leaving a messy toilet.
No.
So it's an interesting challenge.
Because it's not like you can just leave the building and nobody will know. You're like looking over at like crew member number 5, be like, I know it was you, Betty.
But with every challenge comes a fun piece of space flight. So, for example, the toilet, the waste management system on the shuttle, you opened a door to get to this very small room, but the door had curtains that you could then put around to make a sort of small private space.
Okay.
And in that private space was the side hatch for the shuttle. And in that side hatch is a window. So this was an outhouse, as it were, with the very, very best view in history. Right? You could look out that window while you're sitting on the throne and you could see thousands of miles off to the left-hand side of the space shuttle, just the left-hand side.
And some planets over here and some planets over there.
So that was the silver lining to the cloud of having to use a tricky system for going to the bathroom in space. Showering, people tried showering on Skylab. I think it's a bit of a waste of water. The way we kept clean was we used wet washcloths wetted with warm soapy water, and you basically just use the washcloth on your body.
Yeah, that's fair.
You don't get that dirty in space.
Yeah, I mean,
because
you don't use the big muscles. You're not sweating as much.
You're not sweating that much unless you go do exercise in space. Just moving things around, again, it's like everything else. It's done with a fingertip push, and it's really about technique and not letting massive things hit important other things like switches and displays. So you do everything slowly, and you don't tend to overheat very much.
Well, how about the exercise in space? I know that NASA has been kind of emphasizing the necessity for folks to engage in more exercise simply because they lose a bit of bone mass while they're in extended space missions. Is it maybe, I guess it would be more difficult to stay clean. And did you guys have any kind of exercise program during your missions?
For our 2-week shuttle missions, even though they were to the space station, they weren't considered long enough that exercise was mandatory for me, for example. I did do some, mostly so that I had the experience of exercising in space, which is interesting. The machinery doesn't work the way it works in 1G. For example, in 1G, if you want to use an exercise bicycle, you just sit on the seat. And when you push down on the pedals, that's your weight pushing down and you don't move anywhere. If you tried to sit on a terrestrial exercise bicycle in space and you push down on the pedals, you would just go up off the seat towards the ceiling. So the exercise equipment is designed a bit differently, and it has to be used a bit differently. And you do sweat, and then, of course, you have to clean up afterwards. But exercise is really important for people who are staying more than 2 weeks. For people who are spending 3, 6, 12 months in space, if they don't exercise, as you said, they lose bone density, particularly in some very important parts of the body, the wrist, the top of the femur where it attaches to the hip. Places that back on Earth, it's really important to have good bone density and strength so that you don't injure yourself when you get home. And of course, they also lose muscle mass if they don't exercise. And I think people who are used to exercising just feel better when they've exercised. So it has a psychological support function as well.
Yeah. it actually is really beneficial for your mental state and acuity, and it's keeps you sharp and actually helps balance out the hormones. But do you still keep in touch with your crewmates?
I do. Some of them particularly. I just talked to one of them a couple of days ago. So yes, you when you've flown in space with people, it's a very special experience. It's a bonding experience. You become a close-knit, hopefully highly effective team. And I think on my 2 shuttle missions, we were highly effective. And so you do build a special relationship with people. And also the folks I worked with at NASA were an extraordinary group. They were just great to work with.
You wouldn't want to lose touch with folks like that because, I mean, you've all had this amazing experience together, just kind of the once in a lifetime, or for you, twice in a lifetime. And it's...
maybe 3 times, Karina, maybe 3 times. We don't know.
Fair enough. I guess we'll circle around to that.